A SEAL Admiral mocked a janitor during inspection, just trying to get a laugh. "What's your rank, soldier?" he joked. The man didn't smile. He just said two words that froze the room. Major General. What happened next would expose a hidden identity, rewrite a piece of military history, and reveal how a forgotten man outsmarted the very system that erased him. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. More is on the way. The sun hadn't risen yet over the Pacific Joint Special Operations Facility in San Diego. Fluorescent lights buzzed quietly inside the empty hallways as a maintenance worker moved with quiet precision. His name was Henry Lawson. Gray coveralls, low-profile ID badge, pushcart stocked with cleaning supplies. To the officers passing by, he was invisible. He preferred it that way. Most never asked his name. Those who did forgot it within hours. He cleaned without complaint. He vanished before conversations began. He was reliable, methodical, unremarkable by design. But there were patterns. He walked like a man trained to cover ground with purpose. He noticed things others missed. And when tension rose inside the facility, so did his awareness. No one knew that 15 years earlier, Henry Lawson had worn stars on his shoulder. Once a major general, now a janitor. That morning, a SEAL Admiral visiting from headquarters would stop him with a smirk. "What's your rank, soldier?" The room laughed. Lawson looked up, calm, clear. "Major General." And in that silence that followed, every officer realized they had just mocked the kind of man they could only dream of becoming. By 0600, the facility was fully alive. Officers moved briskly between briefing rooms. Tension buzzed in the air like static before a storm. Admiral Lucas Stratton's surprise inspection wasn't just administrative, it was career-defining. Staff scrambled to polish not just the floors, but their records, their chain of command, and their narratives. Everyone felt watched. Everyone except Lawson. He moved unnoticed down the west corridor, emptying trash bins, wiping smudged glass, replacing toilet paper rolls with the same quiet rhythm he had maintained for 8 years. In the officers' restroom, 3 junior lieutenants laughed loudly as they adjusted their uniforms in the mirror. They ignored Lawson entirely. "Stratton's going to tear this place apart," one said. "I heard he makes officers scrub urinals if they're out of spec." Another joked, "Hope our janitor here brought backup." The third added, glancing briefly at Lawson with a smirk. He didn't respond. He didn't flinch. He cleaned the mirror as their reflections vanished from its glass. But he noticed something. A small etching carved into the corner of the mirror, "Maintenance, where failed officers go to die." Lawson sprayed the glass slowly, and with a practiced hand erased it. In the central command hub, a cluster of senior officers debated a developing situation. A satellite feed showed concerning movement near a joint operations post overseas. Intelligence was thin. Responses were clashing. "If we move air support now, we violate regional protocols, delay, and we risk a breach at the southern perimeter. Ground teams will be isolated in 12 hours without intervention." Lawson entered quietly from the side, emptying trash bins. He didn't speak, but as he passed the digital operations map, he made a subtle adjustment. He rotated his cart slightly, its long handle now pointed toward a narrow mountain pass on the western flank. A corridor barely discussed in the briefing, overlooked, shielded, viable. Captain Miller paused mid-sentence. "Wait, what about this approach?" he asked, gesturing to the west. "The valley's outside the restricted airspace and provides natural cover. No satellite line of sight." Heads turned. A new tactical threat emerged. Nobody noticed the janitor step quietly into the hallway. Except one. Lieutenant Ava Monroe had been standing at the edge of the room, silent, watching. She caught the motion of the cart, the angle of the handle, the suggestion without words. And she remembered something. Later that afternoon, Monroe found Lawson polishing the glass displays in the Hall of Honors, where medals, commendations, and legacy missions were displayed in chronological pride. "Mr. Lawson," she said, reading his name tag. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, still cleaning. "I saw what you did in the command room." He didn't stop wiping the glass. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am." "You angled your cart to point at that western pass. No one mentioned it before you arrived." Lawson paused, briefly. Just cleaning around the important work, ma'am. She studied him carefully. I served under a Colonel Lawson early in my career, she added. Any relation? Common name, he said, moving to the next case. Not that common, she countered. She waited. He didn't turn around. Colonel Lawson had a reputation, she continued. Spatial awareness, tactical instinct. He could read a map like a surgeon reads anatomy. Sounds impressive, Lawson replied, expression flat. He disappeared after Hermes Valley. No retirement, no transfer, just gone. Things get lost in the system, he answered. Monroe leaned against the wall, arms crossed. People don't, she said, especially not officers with that kind of record. Lawson finally turned, calm, impassive. Was there a maintenance issue you needed help with, Lieutenant? She held his gaze. No, she said quietly. Not right now. She walked away, but he knew the conversation wasn't over. That night, Lawson returned to his small apartment 2 blocks from the facility, a third-floor walk-up, clean, unassuming. Inside, his son Caleb sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by books. At 17, the boy carried his mother's eyes and his father's quiet precision. MIT applications, Henry asked, removing his jacket. Almost done, Caleb replied. They want family military history for the Veterans Day profile. Lawson's hand slowed. Tell them we don't have any. Everyone has something, Caleb said. Grandparents, cousins, something. I need to submit it this week. Henry opened the fridge. The conversation ended there. They ate dinner like 2 men sharing space, not secrets. Afterward, Caleb borrowed a calculator from his father's desk. While searching, he found a photograph tucked behind a drawer, faded, framed, face down. He pulled it out half curious. It showed a younger man in uniform, accepting a medal from someone just out of frame. The man's posture was unmistakable. So was the name on the citation. Henry Lawson, Major General. He didn't get to read the rest. Henry stood silently in the doorway. Some doors, he said quietly. Stay closed to keep what's inside safe. Caleb put the frame back. Sorry, he said. Henry nodded. Top drawer, he added. Calculator's always there. Like everything else in their carefully structured lives, the following morning arrived under overcast skies. Inspection was scheduled for SRU 800, but by SRU 530, Admiral Lucas Stratton's advance team had already arrived unannounced. The atmosphere inside the Pacific Joint Special Operations Facility shifted instantly. Tension that had simmered for days now surged to the surface. Officers who once walked past the janitor without acknowledgement now tracked every movement of his mop. Every smudge became a liability, every imperfection a threat. Henry Lawson continued his work in silence. The pressure didn't rattle him. He'd seen worse, much worse. But this time, something was different. At Auto 615, while cleaning the corridor outside the main conference room, Lawson witnessed a minor collision between 2 staffers. A young aide dropped a stack of folders, papers scattered across the floor. Lawson crouched to help. One folder, marked with a bright red band, caught his eye. Operation Hermes, fall classified. His hand paused for less than a second, barely noticeable, but someone noticed. Lieutenant Ava Monroe. She'd been walking past, unnoticed until now. She caught the moment the hesitation that shouldn't have existed. Thank you, the aide muttered, gathering the folder and hurrying on. Lawson said nothing, just returned to his mop. But Monroe stared at him for a moment longer, and the wheels began to turn. By late morning, the base was operating in full inspection mode. Stratton's team had taken over the command center. Officers were being questioned, logs reviewed, maintenance records scrutinized. Lawson moved as he always did, efficient, invisible, until he passed the officers' mess hall. Inside, 2 senior officers sat at a corner table, speaking in hushed tones over coffee. Lawson was clearing trays just feet away. They didn't notice him. They never had. I still say Stratton wasn't even on the ground during Hermes. One said, he's the one in the official reports. The other replied, my old CO said it was someone else, someone who disappeared after it went sideways, quietly reassigned or buried. Lawson collected their trays. No eye contact, no reaction. but his grip on the edge of the tray tightened slightly. Later that evening, long after most personnel had cleared out, Lieutenant Monroe returned to the Central Archives. She used her clearance slightly stretched to access mission logs from 15 years ago. Hermes Fall, a blacked-out mess. Names redacted, orders classified, strategic records sanitized. Except for one citation unusually vague, yet still present. Awarded for tactical brilliance under impossible conditions. No name, no rank. But it referenced a commander whose extraction route had become standard doctrine in naval special warfare since. That tactical route, Monroe realized, was the same path Lawson had pointed to, unintentionally or not, during that morning's briefing. Coincidence? She wasn't sure anymore. Back in his apartment, Lawson prepared dinner with practiced repetition. Caleb sat at the table again, quiet, focused, but restless. "Dad," he said, not looking up, "do we have enemies?" The question hung in the room like a live wire. "Why would you ask that?" "I got a message," Caleb said. "Someone sent me an article from 15 years ago about a woman named Eleanor Lawson, an intelligence analyst who died in a suspicious accident. It says she was your wife." Henry froze. "That's not something school archives would just send you?" "I know," Caleb replied, "and it came with a text, just one line." Lawson waited. Hermes rises at dawn, he knows. For the first time in years, Henry Lawson felt its exposure. His cover, carefully preserved for over a decade, was unraveling. Not by force, by precision. Whoever was watching him knew exactly how to strike, not through him, through his son. That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Lawson retrieved a locked box from the top kitchen cabinet. Inside, a folded service flag, a Navy cross, a series of sealed envelopes marked "in case of recall," and at the bottom, a worn leather-bound journal. He opened to the first page. Inside, pasted carefully, was the original newspaper clipping. Decorated commander honored for hostage rescue photo, Henry Lawson in full uniform, standing at attention. Below it, dated just weeks later. Intelligence officer killed in unresolved car crash foul, play suspected. Lawson closed the journal. The muscles in his jaw shifted, but his face remained composed. If someone had broken through his firewall, it meant one thing. Lucas Stratton knew, and the inspection was no longer about readiness. It was about leverage. The day of the formal inspection, Lawson entered the East Wing early, assigned to finalize sanitation in high-security conference areas. Commander Ellis intercepted him. "I want every inch of the East Wing spotless," he barked. "Stratton's already flagged 3 departments." "Yes, sir," Lawson replied evenly. Ellis paused. "For God's sake, Calloway!" Lawson froze. He hadn't been called that name in 15 years. But Ellis didn't notice. He was already walking away. In the hallway, Lieutenant Monroe stood near the honors display again. She had been waiting. "Mr. Lawson," she said quietly, "why does your service history only go back 8 years?" Lawson didn't answer. "There's no record of you before that. No military record, no public employment. It's like you were created out of thin air." Lawson looked at her, calm, still. "Some things are better left buried, Lieutenant." "Not when lives are built on lies," Monroe replied. "Not when someone like Stratton walks around wearing medals he didn't earn." Lawson's face didn't change, but Monroe noticed something different this time. He didn't deny it. The inspection would begin in less than an hour, and the man everyone dismissed as a janitor was about to come face to face with the man who stole his name, his honor, and maybe his wife's life. By 06-4, the facility stood on edge. Uniforms were crisper, voices lower, movements more measured. Admiral Lucas Stratton's motorcade had just passed through the main gate. Inspection would begin in minutes. Lieutenant Ava Monroe stood at her post outside the main conference room, but her focus wasn't on the protocol. It was on a man in gray coveralls. Henry Lawson. He moved across the hallway with the same silent efficiency as always. Yet now, every gesture carried weight. Not because he changed, because she had. Her perspective had shifted. For 8 years, Monroe had walked past Lawson without a second glance. Everyone had. He blended in by design. But now, the way he positioned display cases, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he anticipated risk before it happened. These weren't habits of a maintenance worker. They were the instincts of a man who had once commanded others under fire. Inside the briefing room, Captain Joel Warren reviewed the inspection agenda. "We begin with command structure review," he said to his team, "then tactical readiness and finally facilities operations." "Include maintenance?" an officer asked, half joking. "Yes," Warren replied flatly. The Admiral insisted on reviewing all personnel, military and civilian. That raised eyebrows. It wasn't standard. But Stratton had been clear: every department, every staff file, every hallway. At 0702, the inspection began. Admiral Stratton entered the facility with 2 aides, his expression unreadable. He greeted no one. His presence spoke for him. A shark in calm water. Monroe followed the entourage as they moved through operations, then logistics. Then they reached facilities. The janitor was waiting. Lawson stood near the equipment storage room, head slightly bowed, mop upright, uniform perfectly neutral. For a moment, Stratton looked directly at him. Recognition flickered in the Admiral's eyes. He said nothing, but he paused longer than necessary. Then turned to Monroe. "Lieutenant," he said, "full file review. All civilian personnel. Start with long-term maintenance staff." "Yes, sir." Stratton continued walking. Only Monroe saw Lawson's eyes narrow barely. He knew what was happening. Minutes later, Monroe cornered him in the corridor. "He's targeting you," she said plainly. "That file request, he's forcing exposure." "I know," Lawson replied. "You should leave the facility." "No," he said. "He won't come at me directly. Not yet. Not while others are watching." "What's his endgame?" Lawson looked at her, calm, unblinking. "Control." Monroe swallowed. "Is it true, were you really in command during Hermes?" Lawson didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded once. "I wrote the extraction strategy. Stratton was stationed at command. He monitored radios. But the credit was handed to him before I landed," Lawson said. "By the time we returned, the version of the story that advanced his career was already official record." "And your wife?" Lawson's face didn't change. "She discovered the discrepancy while reviewing the mission for analysis training. She filed a report." Monroe hesitated, "And she died days later." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. In the East Corridor, Stratton reviewed a display of recent commendations. He wasn't looking at the awards. He was watching the hallway behind him, waiting for Lawson to appear. The janitor. The ghost. The mistake Stratton had buried and now had to destroy before others found the truth buried with him. At 0735, as Stratton's team regrouped in the conference room, a commotion broke the silence. 2 officers entered, escorting a young man, civilian clothes, backpack, confused expression. "Caleb Lawson?" Stratton turned slowly. "Who authorized his presence?" he asked. "Security received instructions from your aide," the officer replied. Stratton didn't deny it. He simply said, "Bring him in." In the corner of the hallway, Monroe watched as Caleb was led inside. She turned back toward the maintenance room, but Lawson was already there. Standing still, focused, controlled. "They brought him in," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. Monroe stepped closer. "What are you going to do?" Lawson looked through the glass panel of the conference room door. Inside, Stratton leaned forward, speaking softly to Caleb. The boy sat rigid, uncertain. Henry Lawson exhaled slowly. "I'm going to let them see," he said. "See what?" He turned toward her. "The man they buried." At 0743, Lawson stepped into the main conference room. Conversation stopped. For the first time in 15 years, officers stood face to face with a man they never knew had been watching them. Admiral Stratton smiled faintly. "Facilities maintenance?" he asked, tone dry. "Yes, sir," Lawson answered, voice low but clear. "How long have you served in this building?" 8 years. And before that, a pause. Lawson's gaze didn't shift. "Various commands," he replied. "Nothing worth noting." Stratton's smile tightened. "I disagree." Then, almost conversationally, he added, "You've always had a talent for choosing angles. I noticed it in the field. The message was clear, a threat disguised as small talk. But Lawson didn't respond. He didn't need to. Monroe watched from the perimeter of the room. She saw something no one else did. Not just the tension, not just the history, but the shift in posture. The moment Lawson stopped being invisible. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't issue threats, he simply existed, fully. And for Stratton, that was more dangerous than anything said aloud. Inspection continued. But the power had shifted, and the man in the janitor's uniform once overlooked was now seen. Truly seen. For the first time in over a decade, the room hadn't fully recovered from Lawson's quiet revelation. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't present evidence, he simply stood there, shoulders square, eyes steady, bearing unmistakable. The janitor had vanished. In his place stood a soldier. Admiral Lucas Stratton adjusted his uniform. His expression remained controlled, but those close to him saw something shift, a calculation, a narrowing of options. He didn't speak to Lawson again. Not yet. Instead, he turned to Lieutenant Monroe. I want full background reports on this man. Cross-check civilian records, immigration, personnel logs, everything. Deliver it before sunset. Yes, sir, Monroe replied, but her tone lacked conviction. Stratton turned to leave the room, his aides falling in behind. As he passed, his voice dropped to a whisper only Lawson could hear. You should have stayed in the dark. Lawson didn't flinch. I did, until you brought my son into the light. Back in the hallway, Monroe caught up to Lawson. What was that, she asked, keeping her voice low. A message, Lawson said, from a man who just realized I'm still alive and still watching. Why would he bring Caleb into this? Because he's running out of control, Lawson replied, and desperate men get sloppy. 3 hours later, Monroe sat alone in her office. The personnel system had been locked for over 20 minutes. Stratton's aides had locked down digital records across the facility. She called a T. System access restricted per SecNav security directive, the tech replied. Special review in progress. SecNav. The Secretary of the Navy. Stratton had pulled the highest level of clearance available on short notice. He was sealing the doors before the truth could leak out. At 13:30 hours, Lawson received a message. Anonymous, untraceable. It read, Caleb's name is now in the system. Stratton's moving faster than expected. Lawson didn't reply. Instead, he walked. Not out of the facility, but deeper in. Down past the command wings, past the briefing rooms, to the secure archive floor that hadn't been used since peacetime protocols were instated. The guards didn't stop him. They never had. He was maintenance, after all. But Lawson didn't need access to the archives. He needed what was hidden beneath them. In 2009, during construction of the West Annex, Lawson had personally overseen the secure routing of fiber infrastructure. At the time, he was still a commander, still in uniform. And he had embedded something there. An offline drive, physically shielded, buried in insulation and heat mesh, unreachable by remote systems. Inside that drive, mission briefings from Operation Hermes, raw satellite overlays, personnel logs unaltered, and most importantly, encrypted voice transmissions. Proof of who was in command, of who gave the orders, of who rewrote history. At 15:10 hours, Lawson entered the maintenance bay carrying an old toolkit and a sealed weatherproof case. Caleb was waiting there, escorted under the radar by Monroe. Is this really happening? Caleb asked. Lawson met his son's eyes. It always was. What's in the case? Insurance, Lawson replied. Evidence, truth, something people died to protect. Caleb hesitated, then quietly asked, Does this mean you're going back? To the military, Lawson shook his head. Not unless I have to, but I am stepping forward. No more shadows. Monroe stepped closer. You realize Stratton's next move will be to remove you completely, legally or otherwise. I know, Lawson replied. Then we need to move now, Monroe said. I have someone in Washington, former JAG, still has connections at the Pentagon. We get this to her. She gets it upstairs. And if they bury it, Caleb asked. They won't, Lawson answered. Not this time, not with Stratton already making mistakes. At 1600, a secure video feed lit up in a private room off the comms wing. On screen, a civilian in a suit and DOD credentials. Name Elaine Mercer, former Judge Advocate General. She had received the package. Her words were measured. This evidence crosses multiple lines. It implicates not only Admiral Stratton but 2 members of the Joint Chiefs at the time. Lawson nodded. I want no compensation, no title, just protection for my son and the truth on record. You'll have it, Mercer replied. But General, when this gets out, it won't just end Stratton's career. It'll collapse everything built on Hermes. Lawson leaned in. Then it was never stable to begin with. At 1715, a detachment from Naval Intelligence arrived at the facility. They didn't knock. They took positions at every entrance. They requested digital copies of all inspection files, and they asked to speak to Admiral Lucas Stratton in private. The opportunity had arrived, but not the one Stratton had expected. As he watched the black vehicles arrive, Stratton stood at the window of his temporary office. His hands were still. On the table behind him, a sealed file folder. On the cover, Calloway subject file reinstated. He hadn't been able to erase Lawson after all. And now, the man he once buried under bureaucracy was standing above ground, with truth in hand. At 1800 hours, Lawson stood again in the main hall. Same uniform, same posture, but the room had changed. So had the people inside it. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't a ghost. He was a man with leverage. And for the first time in 15 years, he had options. By nightfall, the facility had changed. Not outwardly. Corridors remained polished. Sentries still rotated posts. But beneath the surface, structure gave way to uncertainty. Lawson had pulled a thread. Now, the entire fabric was shifting. Inside a secured briefing room, Department of Defense investigators played footage collected over the last 72 hours. It showed Stratton's unusual inspection demands, his unauthorized use of security teams, the moment Caleb Lawson entered the facility unregistered, unescorted, unapproved. It also showed Henry Lawson, silent in the background. Not hiding. Observing. Always observing. Captain Joel Warren, once skeptical of the rumors, stood outside the room with arms crossed. He had served for 23 years, led men in conflict, earned command through sweat and scars. And yet he had walked past Lawson 100 times. Now, he questioned what else he had failed to see. In the command wing, Lawson stood beside Lieutenant Monroe. They watched as Stratton was escorted to the rear lot by DOD personnel. No cuffs, not yet. But his posture-tight shoulders, clenched jaw confirmed what Lawson already knew. The Admiral had lost control, not from force, from exposure. 15 years, Monroe said softly. You carried this in silence. Lawson nodded once. It wasn't about revenge, he said. It was about survival. Monroe looked at him carefully. And now, Lawson took a breath. Now it's about responsibility. In a private dormitory nearby, Caleb sat quietly on the edge of a bunk. His phone buzzed, but he ignored it. He was reading. A military file redacted, recompiled, and finally unlocked by investigators earlier that evening. Inside, it told the real story of Operation Hermes. It told his father's story. Not the janitor's, not the ghost, the commander. For years, Caleb had wondered what his father was hiding. Now he knew. And for the first time, he understood the burden of silence. Hours later, father and son stood on the rooftop overlooking the base. Night breeze, empty sky. Only the red blinking tower lights reminded them they weren't completely alone. You were never just a janitor, Caleb said. No, Lawson admitted, but I needed you to believe that until it was safe. Do you regret it? Lawson took a long pause. I regret what it cost your mother, but I don't regret keeping you alive. They stood in silence. Then Caleb asked, and now that they know who you are, who do you become again? Lawson's answer came without hesitation. Someone who doesn't have to hide. The following morning, a memo arrived from Washington. Effective immediately. Major General Henry Lawson is to be reinstated for the purposes of advisory and strategic review, pending permanent assignment, clearance restored, identity no longer classified. It was official. The name he buried had resurfaced. At the same hour, Commander Ellis, who once barked orders at a man he considered beneath him, approached Lawson near the east wing. "I owe you an apology," Ellis said awkwardly. "I didn't know." "You weren't supposed to," Lawson replied. Ellis hesitated. "Still, the way we treated you." "I accepted it," Lawson said simply, "because invisibility gave me what I needed: time." Then, just before walking away, he added, "Pay closer attention next time to who's in the room and who isn't." That afternoon, inside the lecture room at Tactical Development, Lawson stood before a group of junior officers. He wasn't there to teach rank or legacy. He was there to teach clarity under fire. "Maps don't win battles," he began. "Neither do titles." He paused. "Awareness does. Observation, discipline. The things you ignore are often the things that decide whether you walk out or don't." Monroe stood near the back, arms crossed, listening with quiet admiration. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't speak of honor or vengeance. He spoke of patterns, blind spots, weaknesses in perception. And he spoke with the authority of someone who had spent 15 years watching people overlook everything that mattered. Outside, after the session, Caleb waited by the curb with a worn backpack. "MIT accepted the early placement," he said, holding up the email. "They even offered a housing program for dependents of high-clearance personnel." Lawson smiled. "That's good. I think you should come with me," Caleb added. "There's a visiting professor role open in applied strategy. They want someone with real-world insight." Lawson raised an eyebrow. "From janitor to lecturer." "From general to father," Caleb corrected. "They're the same thing, really. Just different audiences." Lawson gave a small nod. Maybe for the first time, he saw a future where he didn't have to disappear. Where the mission wasn't silence, but guidance. As the sun set behind the base, and Admiral Stratton boarded a plane under federal escort, Major General Henry Lawson walked out of the shadows he'd lived in for too long. Not to reclaim power, but to reclaim purpose. 3 days after Admiral Stratton's detainment, the Pacific Joint Special Operations Facility operated under quiet recalibration. Internal reviews had begun, policies were updated, and officers, some embarrassed, some humbled, walked more deliberately past those they'd once ignored. No one looked at the janitorial staff the same way again. Because they had seen what happened when you underestimate the wrong man. Major General Henry Lawson now formally reinstated declined promotion. He requested no ceremony, no ribbon cutting, no speech. Instead, he requested a transfer to a small lecture role at a joint civilian-military academic program outside Boston, 2 hours from MIT, 15 minutes from where Caleb would be living. On his final day at the San Diego facility, Lawson stood quietly outside the East Wing, a place he had cleaned, alone, in silence for years. Ava Monroe found him there, carrying a thin file. "Personnel's requesting a summary of your time here," she said. 8 years, maintenance." Lawson looked at the folder. "Leave it blank." Monroe tilted her head. "You sure?" Lawson nodded. "Let it stay the way it was. That cover did its job." She tucked the folder under her arm, then added, "You know, when you first got here, I thought you were slow. The way you watched everything. Kept to yourself." "I wasn't slow," Lawson replied. "I was recording." Monroe smirked. "Yeah, I know that now." She reached out to shake his hand. "It was an honor, sir, even when I didn't know who you were." "You treated me with more respect than most who did," he said. "That says more about you than about me." Outside the facility, a black government SUV waited. Caleb leaned against it, scrolling through an MIT welcome email on his phone. When Lawson approached, Caleb looked up. "You ready?" he asked. Lawson nodded, always. They didn't say much else. No dramatic goodbyes, no proud declarations. Just a father and son walking side by side. As the vehicle pulled away from the gate, the guard saluted. They didn't salute the car. They saluted the man inside it. For years, they never knew he was there. Now, they wouldn't forget. Weeks later, Henry Lawson stepped into a lecture hall in Cambridge, civilian dress, no rank insignia, just a name tag H, Lawson, Strategic Analysis Adjunct. He taught without flair. No stories of medals or lost years. He asked questions. He told students to think quieter, slower, to stop waiting for chaos to reveal truth. Most decisions are made before the gunfire, he told them, and most failures happen because someone didn't see what was standing right in front of them. Back at MIT Housing, Caleb adjusted to a new rhythm. Class by day, research at night. Occasionally, he'd spot his father walking the path between academic buildings, unnoticed among professors and students. But Caleb saw him differently now. Not as a figure hidden behind old grief, but as a man who carried it with purpose. In an advanced seminar on asymmetric warfare, a student asked Lawson a pointed question. "Sir, do you believe legacy matters more than truth?" Lawson paused, then replied, "Legacy is what people write after you're gone. Truth is what you choose to carry while you're still here." By winter, an article appeared in a quiet military journal. "The Ghost of Hermes, One Officer's Silent Watch," authored anonymously, written in plain language. It didn't name names, but those who knew understood exactly who it was about. A man who protected his son above his title, who let his reputation rot to keep someone else breathing, who swept the halls of a facility built on his own operation so he could make sure history didn't repeat itself. Back in San Diego, Monroe kept a copy of the article in her desk. No one else knew she had it. No one needed to. She'd already learned the lesson. Some warriors don't fight for recognition. They fight to give others a future. In Boston, as snow fell along the Charles River, Henry Lawson sat beside Caleb in a quiet diner. No uniforms, no handlers, just a father and son. "You still miss it?" Caleb asked. "The uniform. The war, the command, that part of you." Lawson stirred his coffee. "I miss what it stood for," he said, "not what it became." "Do you think people like Stratton ever regret it?" "No," Lawson replied simply. "But they notice when the quiet ones stand up." Caleb leaned back. "I'm glad you stood up." Lawson looked at him calm, composed. "You were the reason I stayed down as long as I did," he said. "You're the reason I stood up when it mattered." They sat in silence for a while longer. And in that stillness, Lawson understood something simple. He hadn't come out of hiding to reclaim his name. He had come out to give his son a world where silence was no longer necessary. And that was enough. Some heroes never raise their voices, they don't wear medals, and they don't ask to be seen. Henry Lawson didn't hide because he was ashamed. He hid because that was the only way to protect what truly mattered. In a world where recognition often overshadows responsibility, his story reminds us that the strongest leadership is sometimes invisible. It isn't loud. It doesn't demand praise. It waits. It watches. And when the time is right, it acts. For 15 years, he swept floors in the very facility he helped design, not to relive the past, but to ensure the future remained safe for his son, for truth. The lesson is simple. Honor isn't measured by public applause, but by the quiet choices made when no one is watching. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more untold truths behind quiet heroes. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever known someone who made a difference without ever needing the credit?